Hi, Chapel A. It's really good to be back with you again. Charlotte Naylor Davis here. And thank you for asking me to do this, particularly after you've had such an amazing month listening to Professor Nash. Oh my goodness, how great were those weeks? I have learned so much, and I think I really valued the way she used the Bible and that text to illuminate so many things about real life and how real history and particularly people's marginalized history can land itself in the Bible and in the story of the Bible, and that can relate. And I'm really hoping that I can do a little bit of that with women. I know I come from a very different perspective in some regards, and partly just she's an excellent theologian, and I am sort of a biblical scholar more than anything. But I really hope we can do a little bit of that with women as well. So this series this month is called Biblical Women and Us: The Good, the Bad, and the Other. And I'm hoping to just bring a little bit of new understanding and new thinking to our understanding of the stories of women in the Bible, but also what they mean to us and how we can relate to them, because they have often been put across in ways that are very cultural and maybe not so positive at certain times, or we think that the Bible has to be either entirely good for women or entirely bad for women. And we're going to drive a wedge in the middle of there, find the texts, find the real stories of some of these women, and think about them a bit differently. I think it's worth putting in a content warning at this point, because today I'm going to talk about the stories of Esther and Ruth, and that means I will end up talking about sexual abuse and issues around those sorts of things. So I just wanted to content warn that and flag it for you. I'm going to talk about those issues quite early on today as well. It's just impossible to avoid when we're talking about biblical texts and women, because actually a lot of what's gone on in our Bible and the way that the Bible has been used has been quite negative for women, and touches on these issues. And I'll explain more about why I don't think that's an awful thing, that these issues get touched on later. But I want to flag that for you. So do be aware that these are the issues that we're going to talk about and that are going to come up as we go along. So this is hopefully just 20 minutes. I've actually re-recorded this because I recorded it once and it was 30 minutes. So I'm trying to edit it down a little bit for you. Get to the point, Charlotte, get to the point. So at Cafe Church in 2 weeks' time, we're going to look at some bad women and the bad women of the Bible and what we think about them. And then we'll get onto the other at the very end of the month. It's important that we talk about women in the Bible because 50% of our population are women or non-binary, and therefore not everybody is male. And I think with the advent recently of things like the Me Too movement, the Sarah Everard case, we're becoming more and more aware that in our culture, actually, women still feel, and particularly anybody in a marginalized gender group, particularly still feels very vulnerable to violence and very much still actually oppressed and pushed aside and not centered. And I know sometimes it feels like women are at the center of everything because these things are being talked about so much, maybe in the groups that you're in Chapel A, the sorts of places that you are. But actually, people, women and other marginalized gender groups, so trans people and non-binary people, are still most likely to be victims of gender-based violence, and that we know that there is problems in our society with the way that we characterize women, and therefore the way that we treat them. And the Bible is part of that. It's really nasty that that's the case. But the way that the Bible has been used over the centuries has created a sort of othering of women, and it's a feedback loop. It's not purely the Bible, actually, because these things feed back on one another. So I've talked many times to you guys, I'm sure, from the last 2 teaching series that I've done with you, that we bring stuff to the text and we read it and then we pull that back out again. And in biblical studies, we call that eisegesis, where we read into the text and then we think that that's what we found. And this happens all the time. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, but it can create things in our culture that maybe are negative and can give people an excuse to marginalise different groups, can give people an excuse particularly to marginalise women, and it's been an excuse for the oppression of women. The Bible has also been a tool for the liberation of women. So as much as there were people quoting the Bible to say women should not have the vote, should not be free to divorce, should not be free to have contraception, those sorts of things, there've always been women saying that they can. There've always been people reading, and men reading the Bible, seeing women in the Bible and saying, no, women are equal. Women and men are equal. And so the Bible can be both things. And we need to avoid saying that the Bible is entirely bad for women. Although I know sometimes I can sound quite negative about it. I don't mean to be. And we also need to avoid saying it's wholly good for women, because the Bible is not entirely positive about women. And there are some texts in our Bible that unfortunately are incredibly violent and in which women are incredibly oppressed. And even the good women are absolutely marginalized, and we often when we're trying to defend the Bible, we push that aside. So what I've got at the end of today are 3 examples of women that I consider to be traditionally held up as good women, and we're just going to have a little bit of a look at how their stories have been told, and how culture has smoothed over the difficulties in their texts to either create a woman who is falsely super positive, or to sort of damp down the freedom that women have. And you'll be able to see how the kind of that patriarchal framework that I talk about a lot in cultural use of the Bible is at play here. I think it's important to remember that the Bible is written from a particular point of view. So the Bible is written predominantly by men, and it is written in a patriarchal culture, and it has a patriarchal framework to it. So the general idea inside of our text is that men are the norm, that maleness is the kind of normative scale, and women are the other that comes in. They are difficult, they are different to men. And men often represent, women often represent that in biblical texts, actually. So negative women, which we'll look at, bad women, in a couple of weeks, are often there because their femaleness itself is considered to be other and othered and is different. And that difference is part of what makes them negative, and it can be used as a rhetorical tool to create negativity. And unfortunately, in our Christian history, we have taken that kind of metaphor, I guess, that metaphorical trope, that rhetorical trope, and we've made it real. So when you think about how Eve has been used, for example, she becomes the foil and she becomes the reason that we can oppress women, because Eve fell, and she fell first and she was deceived. So women are both need protecting because Eve was able to be deceived. So we need to protect them, and we don't educate them, and we keep them safe because they need protecting. And she's also the deceiver and the trickster and the one who can pull a man away from the truth. So women are also witches, and they are dangerous, and they're the things that are going to pull you away. So culture does this quite often. It separates women into good traits and bad traits, and both of them mean we sort of need looking after, and both of them can mean that we're dangerous. We're gentle, but we're also kind of evil. We can't win. I mean, women can never win, you know. But that patriarchal lens is really important to remember, because when we see a story about women, we need to think about who is telling it and whose story we are really seeing inside the text. And usually it's a woman's story told through the eyes of a man. There's a lovely Jane Austen quote where she says that it can be seen that men have the advantage, for they get to tell their own stories. And it's the 18th century, and she's saying, you know, men always have the advantage in history because they tell their story, whereas we don't get to tell ours. And they also tell our story. And she goes on to write about that, obviously. And a lot of her stories we now still people dismiss as kind of chick lit, because men's stories are real stories, but women's stories are just for women. And it's interesting that actually in culture we still feel like that. Commissioning editors for books and films and TV shows still feel very much that men can relate to, just like women can relate to men and women. And we've actually learnt to, and we're taught to, but men can only relate to men. So women's literature, women's films, women's TV, they all get sort of shoved into a side category. They make millions of pounds, nobody minds them, but they you know, they're not considered as quite as serious, maybe. And I think that's interesting as well, because I think we do it often with the biblical stories. So women get used to seeing men as the hero of biblical stories, but men don't tend to get to read books about women, and women as the exemplars that they should be following. And that's partly because of how our stories are told. So our biblical stories frequently are told in a way that set women up as fragmentary. So Cheryl Exum, who's a great scholar, says that the problem with biblical stories is that women are fragments. They're only brought in to enhance the story of the men. There's two major exceptions from that we'll talk about today, Esther and Ruth, but generally women are extras. And because they're fragmentary, instead of reading what's there in the text and just taking that and just saying, okay, it's a fragment, it's a tiny bit of a woman, it's just a tiny story, and leaving it, we fill in the gaps of the female story with the tropes that are most readily to hand. So sometimes we fill in the gaps with the most negative patriarchal things we can think of. I'm going to talk to you about this a little bit in 2 weeks' time with bad women. What is Delilah? What is Jezebel? What are they like? What do we know about them? You can probably tell me an awful lot, but what's actually in the text about them? We fill it in. And we do the same with good women as well. So when you think about all of the qualities that get loaded onto Mary, Jesus's mother, there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets put on her in tradition that actually isn't in the text at all. But we load her with these good things that we want people to think about, because she's a fragment. She's only there for one kind of thing. So we add things, and even if they're positive, we are adding those things into the text. We're giving them extras. Male characters tend to be full. So David, for example, is both good and bad. Samson is good and bad. He can be a judge and he can be weak. David can be an adulterer, a murderer, and also the man after the heart of God. Abraham can be this amazing patriarch, but he's also the man who lies about his wife and gets things wrong all the time, and he's not a great husband, to be honest. He's not a great measure of that. So we want to think about women, and I was going to call this series, by the way, Difficult Women, because I think women are just difficult in our biblical text because they aren't what we want them to be. I want to go to the Bible and I want to find an example because I've been taught to come to the Bible and look for examples to live by. And the women in the Bible don't give me that. And sometimes when I come to the Bible and I read about the women in the Bible, it's violent and they're hurt and they're oppressed and they're sexually violated. Sarah is betrayed by her husband who takes a concubine. Hagar is a slave who is forced to carry a child that's not a love match in any way. When we think about Rachel and Leah, Leah is tricked and they have to feud because one of them is forced to marry and the other one is forced to watch her sister marry the man she loves. The concubine in Judges, Jephthah's daughter. These are violent texts. They're difficult. And I want to come and have an example, but I haven't got a great hero. Maybe Deborah, and we'll talk about her a little bit at the end of today. So what do we do then with them? I think one thing that's really important that would really help us deal with women in the biblical text and also women in our Christian culture and really help us liberate women in our Christian culture to, and anybody who's marginalized in this way actually, to report violence, to report sexual harassment, to stand up against abuse, to stand up against oppression when they see it, is to stop reading our biblical stories as examples we're meant to mimic and see instead a place in the text that we can see that God understands our struggle. So often the Bible has been handed to women and the stories about women have been handed to women and to female children particularly as things we're meant to copy. And because we think we have to copy them, we have to smooth them over. I think, however, our texts about women, our texts about anyone really, to be honest, if I'm honest about what I think is going on with the Hebrew Bible and how we use it, but our texts should, rather than be examples, they should be stories where when we come and we see the violence or we see the oppression or we see the marginalization, we learn to think, this is good, because although it's hard to read, it shows that God understands my struggle. The Bible for me has been an amazing book that in my life that has revealed to me profoundly the love of God. But there are texts in there that speak of pain and difficulty. And for years, I didn't understand what to do with them, because if the Bible is an example for me to live in, it's a manual for life, which is the thing that I really wish we never told anyone, but I did get told a lot. If the Bible's a manual for living, what do I do with this? What do I do with these horrible bits? How do I deal with them? And how do I show them to my non-Christian friends and say, this is the love of God, it's amazing. Oh, yeah, it has got these awful bits in. The book of Judges, maybe just skip that. Don't read about Tamar. How do I do that? But if the Bible is a place that I come to find whether God recognizes and understands my struggle, then the story of these women can be told, and can be told in its fullness, and can be told in its explicitness, and can be told without us smoothing it over. Because we're not meant to live like Sarah and be submissive to a fault. We're meant to know that God understands when we're put in a position where we have to submit. We're not meant to live like Esther and put up with sex trafficking and abuse. But we can see that there's a story that shows us that God knows that this stuff happens. We're not shying away from the bad. And we think about Ruth and the book of Ruth, which is always put across as a love story. We put it across as a love story because we don't know what to do with the desperation in that text. And that is a book about two women who were essentially refugees from a land where they were vulnerable and had nothing. And they come back to their homeland, or they cross to the homeland of for Ruth, a land that has no reason to accept her. And they hope and try to find a way to not be vulnerable. And the way to do that is to assign yourself to a man. There are other women in the text who are being raped and abused. We can't get away from that. But here's a story right in the middle of our Bible that shows us that God knows these things happen. It doesn't give us a kind of great happy ending for everybody. We might not be lucky. We might be the women in the field rather than Ruth. But God knows these things happen. Too often we have smoothed over Esther and Ruth and ignored the violence, the sex trafficking in Esther, the vulnerability of Ruth and Naomi, who will starve without Boaz taking them on. Ruth makes herself look like a bride and offers herself to him, and pretty sure that it's sex that happens on the threshing floor. She makes herself incredibly vulnerable, sexually vulnerable, to get safety. None of us want to think that that is a thing that we have to do. But women do it. It happens all over the world. Women put themselves in situations or end up in situations of no fault of their own where they are abused. What our Bible gives us, what the good women give us, because even their stories are surrounded by this violence, they show us that God understands. Vashti exists in the story of Esther, a woman who does not suffer the abuse of her husband any longer and stands up and leaves, and we see that that is okay. The other thing that happens to women quite often is that the good stuff even gets minimized. So, Deborah. I love Deborah. Deborah is our truly good woman in the Bible. She is a judge over Israel. She holds court under her tree. She's holding court. That is a place of authority. And Barak comes to her and he says that they cannot win without her. And she leads Israel to success. And she is an incredibly strong woman. We might want to think about Judith as well, actually. But Deborah is a great woman. And do you know what's funny? Is that when I was taught about Deborah, I was taught that Deborah only got to be Deborah because God couldn't find a man to do the job. And so he let a woman do it. Not chose a woman, let a woman. So even when there's a really good woman, frequently she gets edited out. She gets smoothed over to not be difficult, because Deborah has been a thorn in the side of conservatives who would say women cannot minister for basically 2,000 years. Deborah and Janiah, and Chloe and Priscilla. Oh, we are difficult women, called to lead, called to learn, called to be wise, called to give judgment, called to help, called to support, and we are difficult. And therefore, those stories get smoothed over as well. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next couple of weeks. We're going to do bad women next. I want you to think about what you know about the bad women in the Bible. Who's bad? Eve, Jezebel, Bathsheba, Delilah. Who are the bad girls? Let's think about the bad women and how their stories have been constructed, and maybe what we can do with them that's useful. So I hope that this has been good. I'm sorry it's 24 minutes. You know I'm wordy by now, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time at Cafe Church, and I'll do another little video for that. So thanks, and God bless. See you soon.